Okay, can I have your attention, please? We have no speakers. We're all loudmouths. You won't need speakers.
That's just to record us.
The microphone is just to record, and we're streaming this live on the internet, so no profanity, please. So welcome to our little Refounding Fathers Society meeting. The Refounding Fathers Society was started in May of 2011 by myself, David Simpson, and about 15 other kind souls who are here tonight. And we're very, very pleased and honored to welcome our special guest tonight. And we'll get to Lord Christopher Monckton, the third Viscount of Brenchley, in just a moment. First, a little Refounding Fathers Society meeting business. If you haven't ever been to one of our meetings, tonight is not going to be a politics. We're angry at the world. We've got to get rid of Obama meeting, even though we do. You may notice that some of us are in coat and tie. This is because we have have come to the revelation that one of the things that's missing in our society and in our culture is that our men don't respect themselves, and it's hard for their women and their children to respect them. And leadership starts at the top. So, gentlemen, next time, jacket, slacks, tie, optional, but jacket. So we're morphing into a bit of a gentleman's society, but we don't want to call it a gentleman's society because it sounds like Visions in New Orleans East. And if you've ever been to Visions, you know what I'm talking about. I've never either, except for that. Okay. Anyways, just a little bit of business tonight. Our club is going to begin doing monthly socials. We're going to do something that the ladies have taught us to do, which is something called book club. And we're going to be studying some really great modern books. Our first book is called The Complete Gentleman. It's written by a gentleman by the name of Brad Minor. And that'll be second week in November. And we'll alternate houses. There'll be a bit of a dinner party. It's a social event. Jacket required. But it'll be a dinner party event. We'll try to get everyone who wants to come a copy of the book, digital or otherwise. Read it. Come to the social, and we'll talk about it. And then we'll take suggestions for the next book, and we'll even try to get authors in if we can. The next social will always be a pub night somewhere or a dinner night. And then the third social, every quarter, will be an actual meeting. We have a brand new website. It's really, really nice. It's called refoundingfathersociety.com. And if you go to the site, if you're here from out of town, and I know we have some out-of-towners here, and you start a chapter in your state or your locality, even on the South Shore you could start a chapter, there's a place for you to register your chapter. And for you guys and gals in your chapter to actually communicate with the entire Refounding Fathers Society, which, by the way, where's Dan Cobb? Right here. How many states? How many chapters now?
16 states, 22
22
chapters.
chapters, 16 states. Not bad for a little group started in Covington, Louisiana in May. Numbers don't really matter. We're not concerned with numbers, and we're not concerned with federal politics either. We're just concerned with character and virtue and writings, teaching, and the actions, the actual deeds of the men we call founders, not so much because they were founders, but because of the way they conducted themselves in public and for the example that they left for us that we are cheerfully ignoring these days. So the Refounding Fathers Society is about getting back to those mannerisms to speak, arts and letters and things, and yes, politics, but politics as they might have practiced them. So if you haven't ever been to one of our meetings, and ladies, you are cordially invited, please consider coming to the book club. Go to refoundingfathersociety.com, and that goes for those of you watching on the internet tonight and the recording. And sign up. Start your own chapter. David will send you a how-to guide. There's no cost. We're not making any money on this. We're not trying to make any money on this. We're trying to save our country is what we're trying to do. One man at a time, one gentleman at a time. And it starts with being gentlemen. So that's really our purpose. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's really great to see such a great crowd. Of course, I know why you're here, and it's not to hear me ramble on. You're here to hear Lord Christopher Monckton. Before Lord Monckton speaks, we'd like to do what we do at every meeting. I'd like to have David lead us in an opening prayer, and I'll turn it over to Dave.
Heavenly Father, we come before you tonight as always in adoration of you and the Blessed Trinity. We thank you for all the blessings you bestowed upon us, our families, our country. We ask that you forgive us our many transgressions, both the things that we've done and those things that we failed to do that we should have. And we ask especially tonight that you bless all those that are here, that they will be moved by your Spirit to be good, to be truthful, and to be beautiful. We ask this in our Lord's name. Amen.
Amen. Okay, now to our special guest, Lord Christopher Monckton. Let me tell you just a little bit about the exquisite gentleman to my right here. He is the third Viscount of Brenchley. Brenchley is what we would call a county, basically, in England. Lord Christopher Monckton is one of the the planet's foremost authority on debunking what I like to call GCW, man-made catastrophic global warming, which, as he will reveal to you, does not exist. Is the planet warming? Yes. Has it warmed in the past? Yes. Has it cooled horrifically? Yes. You don't want to live in an ice age. Lord Monckton will convince you you do not want to live in an ice age. Plants grow where it's warm. They don't grow under frost. Lord Monckton will inform you about all this. Lord Monckton is also an eminent scholar, a forensic scholar, if you will, in one of his duties when he worked with Margaret Thatcher, Lady Thatcher, at 10 Downing Street. He handled the task of going through important documents and making sure that they were accurate. He has some experience here. He stumbled upon a document. It's called a birth certificate of the President of the United States. I am not a birther. Lord Monckton is not a birther either. However, the forensic information does suggest quite strongly that that document is a forgery. He'll talk to you a little bit about that tonight. And what's our third topic? The truth. And of course, always about the truth. I will tell you that if you get a chance to socialize with Lord Monckton, challenge him and ask him to speak to you in a language, he probably will. You can choose French, Greek, German, or Latin, the four that I know that he speaks fluently. He is a world-class, eminent gentleman. I believe after his visit here, he will become a good friend of ours and we of his. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my ultimate honor. I am humbled to be in the presence of the third Viscount of Brenchley, and I give to you Lord Christopher Monckton.
Thank you. Well done. My lords. Oh, that's me. Introduction. I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. It is a huge honor to be here in Covington, to meet so many charming and do you believe in America? Yes. I didn't hear anything. Do you believe in America? Yes. Oh, come on, ladies and gentlemen. Do you believe in America? Yes. Now we're raising the roof, or we would if there was. I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about life, liberty, and happiness, the three unalienable rights which your founding fathers wanted you to have. Now, these rights are each, at the moment, under more of a threat than they have ever been since General Pakenham was defeated at the Battle of Chalmette in 1814. I'm just going to let that Harley go by. I'll try and buy it off him later. Now, I want to talk about each of these three threats in turn. First of all, the threat to life. Now, this threat is the most direct threat there could possibly be, because as a result of the Abortion Act 1967 in Britain, and as a result of Roe v. Wade here in the United States, in your country, is also issue, because I think in the womb of their mothers is not something that we should do. What I am going to do instead is to draw your attention to the practical of this act. Western countries keep talking. I know you can still hear me. So
On. Check, check, check. Can you hear me?
The Muslims, like the Catholics, and like all Christians of goodwill, do
Now?
they regard themselves as, in this respect, morally superior to us. And this moral superiority is, in fact, on this point, one which they are justified in claiming. In all other respects, we may argue that theirs is an authoritarian, medieval theocracy with many aspects of cruelty and sometimes extreme cruelty in its method of operation. But in this one fatal respect, they are morally superior to us. And that has various adverse consequences. One of which is that this is one of the motivations that leads them to feel that our society no longer deserves to exist. And it is also one which allows them to move into our countries and then to breed faster than we do, because they do not kill their babies as we kill ours. And they are gradually, certainly in Britain and in other countries, replacing our population with theirs, and the culture is gradually shifting away from the age of enlightenment and Western liberty and democracy, and backwards towards the medievalism of the Middle East from the 6th to the 11th centuries AD. And in many respects, that is retrograde. We're going backwards. Now, I would like to find a more positive modus vivendi with the Muslims. I was a classicist at Cambridge. I studied the great texts of Greece and Rome. Nearly all of those texts would have been lost to the West had it not been for the Muslim scholars who preserved those texts all the way from the 6th to the 14th centuries, and we found those texts when we invaded Cordoba and drove the Moors back into the sea and found all the texts preserved by the librarians of the Muslim faith there, because in those days the Muslim faith was a faith of scholarship. And I pray that it will become so again. We were able to coexist in a somewhat uneasy fashion with the Muslims in southern Spain in that period, and it led to a marvellous fusion of cultures which reached its architectural apotheosis in the Alhambra. And I rather long for the day when we can once again live somewhat at ease with our Muslim brethren in this country and elsewhere. But while we kill our babies and they do not, to have an easy coexistence is going to be difficult. That then, very briefly, is the threat to life. Life which is guaranteed as an unalienable right in your constitution, but which your Supreme Court was all too willing to take away the first time it got the chance. I now move on, perhaps more conventionally for a group like this, to the threat to liberty that is now before you. And the threat here is will be driven bankrupt, and perhaps deliberately bankrupt, by the overspending and overprinting of the federal government. And so far I have only heard one of the three presidential candidates really getting to grips with this, Johnson, whom I had the pleasure of listening to at Baton Rouge a few nights ago. And I had not really heard of him before. But here was a two-time Republican governor of Democrat New Mexico, a man who has climbed Everest, fit enough to climb it again, which, as you look at me, is more than I should ever be able to do. And the printing of the fare under Mr. Obama, 43 cents on every dollar that this nation spends is borrowed or printed and not earned. If that figure is right, and I do not have sufficient knowledge myself of your public finances to know whether it is, but if anything like that figure is right, then if Mr. Obama occupies the White House on November the 6th, then this nation is doomed. And I'm going to put it as that. And you may think this is unduly apocalyptic. You may who says that just if we elect Mr. Obama again, the nation itself is finished. Well, if we are already because of the interest that you have to pay to China, chiefly, the main source of Mr. Obama's wealth at the moment, because he is borrowing from China. And we do not know, because it has not been made public, and the Republicans are too lazy to ask, I were asked to lend my considerable fortune to the United States under Mr. Obama, I would not be able to do so, because the risk of losing the lot would be very real. Yet China is willing to do so, and one of the biggest unasked questions in this election is why. But I will give you a gloss on this from my time working for Margaret Thatcher. The first thing she did on getting into office was to call in the Treasury mandarins, sit them down and say, right, gentlemen, I require a complete list of how much we owe to any foreign nation, and it is to be paid back at the end of this week, even if you have to borrow it from somewhere else. But she said, we cannot be a sovereign nation while we owe money to other governments. Within the week, while she remained Prime Minister, that not a penny would be borrowed from any foreign government under any circumstances. The moment she went, all subsequent Prime Ministers found it expedient and convenient and profitable to break that rule. So once again, Britain is no longer a sovereign nation, and nor is the United States. And China, which has acquired the wealth that she lends to us, by undercutting our working people, by paying wages which I usually describe with a rude word, and not providing decent health care, not providing workplace health and safety, not providing any welfare system or unemployment cover, not providing decent pensions. And what do the left-wing unions in the tank for Mr. Obama have to say as their members are taken away by the Chinese Here's what they have to say. I quote it in full. They have nothing to say, of course, because they are all good little communists together. And they will not criticize those who, by breaking all the rules that they claim to have fought for on behalf of their own members, are now destroying their own members' jobs. Well, of course, fortunately, there are two parties in this election. Two major parties, anyway. We have the Democrats. We've seen that they don't care. And then, of course, there are the Republicans. And here is what the Republicans have to say about China's exploitation of their workers and thereby their undercutting of our workers and the destruction of our workers' jobs as a result. Well, you know how that one goes by now. Not a dicky bird. Now, what on earth is going on here? Why will the Republicans not fight this election? Okay, so Mr. Romney kind of scored one over the amateur in the debate last night. And he made a couple of very good points. Not the least of which when Obama was saying, look at all those subsidies to those wicked, evil oil companies. Romney, who had all the figures at his fingertips, he is, after all, a very successful businessman, he said, oh yes, he said, $2.5 billion. That's the subsidies to the oil companies, and it doesn't go to the big boys. It doesn't go to the Exxon Mobils. It goes to the little independent drilling companies, who are the ones that are nowadays making the most innovative ways of finding new supplies of shale gas. And he whose so-called green jobs has been 90 billion, which is quite a lot more than the subsidy of $2.5 billion to the oil companies. And as Romney said, and Obama looked even more than characteristically shifty when he said it, he said, and of course, you have given this money to Solyndra, Tesla. You may not have ever seen the Tesla Roadster. This was to be a sport car, 3 million mobile batteries jammed into the car. And the problem was, for a week while you went on holiday, and you came back and tried to start it, the batteries would have completely discharged, and they would never take a charge again. Now, only a state-subsidized organization, particularly one picked by Obama as a winner, could behave quite as incompetently as that. And then there's the Chevy Volt, and nobody seems to want any of those. There's a Prius. Most diesel do a better gas mileage than that. Fact statement, I got my Prius. I'm cool, I'm green, I got my Prius. I mean, what are they on? I want some. And then the killer blow that Romney delivered on this, he said, look, he said, you're trying to pick winners, but you're picking losers. And he said, losers at that. That they got offers of your party and your re-election campaign. That is how the business of government has one of the reasons why this nation is now getting at the United States. Britain is just as bad. We too have had our green frivolities, which have reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, not that they matter very much, but they have cost a fortune. So what we see then is that Romney is saying a little bit about this huge problem of debt. And why is it a threat to America's freedom? Well, in the most direct way, it's a threat to everyone's freedom who wants to spend their own money, but their own money is now taken from them in larger and larger quantities in taxation. Every tax is a reduction in the individual freedom of the citizen. Now, we all accept that some level of taxation, some limitation, therefore, on our freedom to spend our own money, is something we have to put up with. But at the level at which it's now happening, this is no longer really allowing Americans to be free. And another important point, which is not mentioned by any of the candidates in this election, is that the two policies most characteristic of Mr. Obama, the borrowing of other countries' money to fund his lifestyle, and the printing of dollars by the Fed to inflate the currency, these two policies hit the poor first and worst. And I'm not coy like Mr. Romney. I don't talk about low-income families, the politically correct term for people who are poor. If they are poor, and let us call things what they are. It's not their fault necessarily that they're poor, but that's the situation. And if we concentrate on that reality, then we can look at how these policies of Mr. Obama are directly affecting the poor first and worst. Now let's begin, first of all, with inflation. Now, would somebody like to come up, because I'm going to get them to do some math. You, sir. Right.
Thank you. I don't know whether that's any louder, but I hope you can hear me anyway. Right, sir, thank you very much for coming up. Supposing that the American economy is represented by 5 beans. How many beans make 5?
5.
Good man. He's got his first answer correct. All right. Now, if the cash in the economy is $5, how much is each bean worth?
$1.
$1. Give the man a round of applause. Now, suppose I come along, my name is now Bernanke, and I turn on the printing presses and I print another $5. So now we've still got 5 beans in the economy, because I haven't eaten them yet. And we've got now, how many dollars in the economy?
10.
$10. Give him another round of applause. All right, so 5 beans and $10. How many beans will $1 buy you now? I knew he'd get
None.
Well, anybody? Half a bean. There we are. And previously and before I printed the money, you could have bought how many beans with $1?
1.
He's redeemed himself. Thank you very much, sir. Now that's inflation. Now, we, the rich, do not get too much affected by inflation because our Ferraris and our Harleys and our luxury yachts and our enormous mansions are solid objects which the price will go up to match inflation, so inflation doesn't really hurt the rich all that much. The people it does hurt are the poor, because, believe it or not, they don't have Ferraris and Harleys and yachts and mansions. They can't afford any of those things, and so they don't even necessarily have a house of their own. They have to rent. And so they live on a cash economy. And if inflation, therefore, roars away, so that they can only buy half a bean where they could buy 1 bean before, they can starve because of that. It has a really drastic effect upon the poor. And so when you get, as you usually do with socialists, rampant inflation, and Mr. Bernanke has now announced he's going to go on printing money as much as it takes, effectively, to try to keep Obama afloat for a little bit longer and get him through the election, then the effect will be first and worst upon the poor. And the same with the borrowing. Because ultimately, China is going to say, hang on a moment, why are we lending money to this crazed nincompoop in the White House, who is not going ever to be able to pay it back? And quite suddenly they're going to say, we're not going to lend you any more. And when they do, the money to pay the huge welfare checks and the food stamps which were once paid to 32 million people, and if that isn't bad enough, since Obama, it's now 47 million people are on food stamps. Suddenly these can't be paid for anymore. So the first people who are going to get hurt when foreign countries stop lending to us are the poor. And you can already see this happening in Greece, where the handouts to the poor have been drastically reduced. The poor are rioting in the streets, and they're having a really difficult time. And so who is speaking for the poor in this election? Well, I can tell you it isn't Mr. Obama, or he wouldn't be pursuing policies of either inflation or over-borrowing and overspending and overtaxing, all of which things harm the poor. So it isn't him. And we know it isn't Mr. Romney because of that snatch of a private meeting at which he revealingly said he wasn't going to worry, electorally speaking, about the 46 or 47% of your working age electorate who do not pay tax. Now, he wasn't, as the left tried to make out, saying he didn't care about them. He was saying, however, that he didn't think it was worth his while to try to attract their votes. And he said this at the very time when the policies being pursued by the people for whom most of the poor vote are going to do direct, serious, and in some cases fatal harm to those poor people. Now is the time for the Republicans to say, we do have a message for people who are not doing as well as the rest. That was what Ron Reagan did in this country. That was what Margaret Thatcher did in Britain. They both had policies to attract a small but necessary proportion of the poor who will otherwise always and misguidedly vote left, to wake up, come off the Kool-Aid, realize it's the policies of the left that directly damage the poor, and vote for the centre-right, and in this country the Republicans, instead. And Mr. Romney, because he doesn't get that, is probably not going to win the election here. So there is the second of the two threats I wanted to talk about tonight. We've had the threat to life, now we've had the threat to liberty. From the catastrophic, and it almost looks like willful, mismanagement of the economy under the present administration. And before I go on to the third threat, which is the threat to the right to pursue happiness, I want to look at an aspect of this, which again, I think a Republican Party that really intended to fight and win this election would pay some attention to. And that is the not unimportant constitutional question of whether or not Mr. Obama is entitled to sit in the White House. Because your Constitution says perfectly clearly that you have to be a natural-born citizen to do that. Now, I have absolutely no idea where Mr. Obama was born. It may be that since he was naught at the time, he has no idea either. But you can bet your bottom dollar that somebody in the health department in Hawaii knows that he wasn't born in Hawaii. And yet he has a Hawaiian birth certificate, which, in the version that is up on the White House website, says not only that he was born in Hawaii, but that he was born at a particular hospital, on a particular time, on a particular date, with a particular doctor in attendance. Now that document, I don't know where he was born, but that document is unquestionably bogus. I've examined it in some detail. I have got forensic experts to examine it in detail on my behalf and to advise me on various aspects of it. And I'm not going to go into detail now on what they found. You can get that at moncktononline.com or in copies that are circulating around of the briefing paper that I did on this for my peers in the House of Lords. Because this issue could affect us if, at a time when many of the Western economies are faltering as that of the United States is faltering, we will need clear leadership from, in particular, the United States And we're not going to get it from a man who is always having to look over his shoulder because he is worried about the question of whether or not he's going to get away with the bogus document that is currently on the White House website. We cannot afford that distraction at this difficult time in the mind of the leader of the free world. So what are we going to do about it? And this is something which really distresses me, because when I used to investigate government-level frauds of this seriousness in the United Kingdom, it was one of the roles I fulfilled in my 4 years working at 10 Downing Street for Margaret Thatcher. My job was to stop this kind of thing happening, because if it is allowed to happen, particularly if it happens in an in-your-face and very public way, as this one is, then your society cannot remain free. My studies of the civilizations of ancient Greece and ancient Rome have shown that every time open, flagrant public corruption like this is permitted, because everybody finds it expedient and comfortable to look the other way and say, well, that's not the real issue. Let's just talk about only the issues in the election. Corruption is an issue in this election, and yet it does not speak its name. Nobody will talk about it. Now, that is a very serious matter. Every civilization I have studied where this level of corruption has occurred has failed within years of that corruption coming to light and not being dealt with. So I, of course, as a British citizen, have no power to do anything about this at all, except I've been to meet the much decorated and very serious and sensible and non-political sheriff who did the research originally to discover that this document was a forgery. I'm impressed with him and with his lead investigator and with the cold case posse, which at no cost to the taxpayer has given up its own time and trouble for 9 months to establish that this document is indeed a forgery. And I have tried to do various things to give an opportunity to people in the United States to care about this, to do something about it. I, for instance, produced that Peers briefing document which summarizes the evidence in a short form for the first time. Nobody had done that. Then I drafted letters to be sent to every congressman, to every senator, to the head of the Secret Service, which, you may not know this, has a particular investigative duty to check the authenticity of identification documents, as well as to guard the president and the presidency, to the head of the FBI, to the chief justices of the United States and of each state, to the Attorney General of the United States and of each state, to the Secretary of State of each state. But not one of these letters has yet been sent. Nothing has been done so far. Likewise, I identified the one case of the various cases that citizens have brought. Nearly all of them have failed because they were half-assed challenges, improperly funded, badly drawn up, badly fought. And if I'd been the judge, I would have thrown them out. But there was one case I would not have thrown out. So I said to my friends who are concerned with this issue, I have spoken to the guy who's running this case. If you will provide him with a decent lawyer and go this time not straight to the Supreme Court of Alabama, where he went by mistake in first instance, and go to the Court of First Instance first, then the Supreme Court will eventually hear him, because the Supreme Court of Alabama has said that if this case had been properly filed, then the petitioner would indeed have made a serious case that both the short and long form birth certificates of Barack Hussein Obama are forgeries. They are not correct. And that's a senior Supreme Court judge in Alabama saying this. So I said to my friends, all you have to do, I said them 4 months ago, all you have to do is get that guy a decent lawyer who is halfway wide awake and understands how the elementary processes of law work, and file that case at the proper court, ask for an expedited hearing in view of the urgency in the matter, and if any of this had been done by any of them, Obama would no longer be on anybody's ballot. But here's the thing. Nobody in the United States that I have talked to about this, and I've talked to quite a few, has lifted a finger to do that. And so nothing has been done. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you will not fight for your freedom against corruption on this scale and at this high level, then you all thoroughly deserve to see your nation go down. Because no nation can survive unless its people, faced with corruption in government, rise up and take the necessary steps to bring that corruption down. It really is as plain as that. And those who have failed to act upon my advice on this matter, should they see this video, should feel thoroughly ashamed of themselves if, as I now expect, Mr. Obama is not brought down because nobody will lift a finger, and as a result he re-enters the White House as president on November the 7th this year, just over a month from now. And I'm heartbroken that nobody would just concentrate enough to lift a finger and just get these two simple things done. And I'm sorry to have gone on about this point at such length, but I'm really upset to see that when you have a manifest forgery on the White House website is a crime scene. A forgery that has been determined to be a forgery not by me, though I agree with the sheriff on this, but by an experienced and much decorated officer of law enforcement after now 10 months of detailed, careful, meticulous, non-political investigation. And nobody does anything about it. That means trouble. There is, however, one, and only one, last chance, now that these other two things that I had tried to beg you to do have not been done. And that is this. Any candidate for president in this election unquestionably has standing before the court to have this matter raised at an official level by the Attorney General of each state, or the Secretary of State in Louisiana, for instance, who is the returning officer for the presidential election, and to say, you have a duty to satisfy yourself in view of the legitimate doubt that has been raised about the president's fitness to hold the office, and in view of the fact that the state of Hawaii has sat there for more than a year, knowing that a bogus document purporting to be one of its documents is up there on the White House website and has said nothing. It can therefore no longer rely on the full faith and credit clause in the Constitution, so that we have to take its word for it, because it has allowed that forged document to remain on the website. Instead, courts must order the Hawaiian government to produce, for forensic examination by the sheriff's investigators, the original document on the files in the bound volumes in the vaults of the Health Department of Hawaii, and they must also see the original ledger of the Kapiolani Hospital in which it is said the birth of Mr. Obama is recorded. For there is a law in Hawaii at that time which allowed any Hawaiian parent to register a birth as a Hawaiian birth, even if the child was born overseas. The law actually allowed them to do that. It should not have done. It's another instance of corruption. It was a recognized backdoor way of getting American citizenship for children born overseas at that time. Many examples of that have been found and proven by the investigators for the sheriff. And there is a birth record for Obama in Hawaii, but I suspect that once it was examined, it would be found to be one of those birth records that doesn't actually say he was born in Hawaii at a particular time and hospital and place, but merely said that this is a Hawaiian birth registered under this law because he was born somewhere else. So it is necessary, therefore, for a presidential candidate, Mr. Romney, perhaps, Mr. Johnson, perhaps, to write privately. They don't need to make this a major issue in public in the campaign. They can pietistically say other things matter more. But privately, they should be complaining to every state where there is a ballot on which his name and theirs appears. They should be complaining to the FBI, to the Secret Service, and to the other investigating authorities, to the Electoral Commission. And they should be making absolutely sure that if those bodies do not act, even at the instance of a candidate in this election, then a court order is sought to open up the record in Hawaii. Because here's the puzzling thing. We know Obama is worried about this matter because otherwise he wouldn't have put this bogus document on the White House website in the first place. If he was confident that it was genuine, by now, given the fuss about it, he would have got on to Hawaii, as Hawaiian law allows him to do, and said, I will agree with you if you'll be kind enough to open up the record to the sheriff's forensic scrutiny so that everybody can see that the document is genuine. And yet, he has not done this. And that is the most puzzling aspect of the whole case. If that document's genuine, why on earth hasn't he done this? Now, you may say, well, perhaps he's going to wait and make it an October surprise. Well, I don't think so. And even if he did, he's left it rather too late. It's done him a lot of electoral damage already, and very little of that would now be reversed if he came out and said, ha-ha, fooled you. And people would say, why did you monkey around with us in this way for all that time, rather than doing this when it first became apparent that the document on that white website was a forgery? Now, in all of this, I have not said anything pointy-headed or birtherish. I have not said I know that Obama was born somewhere else. I have no idea where he was born, nor perhaps does he. But if you will not deal with this issue, and if that man who perhaps has an alien point of view because he was born and brought up somewhere else in a different tradition, and therefore does not understand your country, and perhaps even means it ill, and yet he occupies that office, great damage has been done and will continue to be done. John Jay and George Washington, when they inserted that clause into the draft of the Constitution, did so precisely because they did not want an alien viewpoint in the White House. They wanted a particularly American viewpoint in the White House, so that nobody could come from outside, capture your country's government and damage it, and perhaps fatally damage your nation. There was a reason for that clause. That is why Congress, despite frequent attempts by those who want aliens to be able to stand as president, has always resisted any calls to have that part of the Constitution repealed. So there it is. I hope that those to whom this video may come will wake up, particularly the candidates who are opposing him, and will actually fight for this country by getting this matter cleared up once and for all, because they, and only they, now, at this late hour, because nobody else would do what I asked them to do when there was time to do it, only they can now save your country from this man who may be, I don't say he is, but he may be an imposter, continuing to occupy the White House. Now, if there is anybody who thinks I shouldn't have spent time on this, then please raise your hand now. So I think there is general agreement that this is something which, whatever one's own view on it, needs to be sorted out and put to bed by the simple method of opening up the record. So now then, finally, to the third threat to your freedoms, the freedom to pursue happiness. And this threat is from the environmental movement. Now, of course, what has happened is that when the Berlin Wall came down, all the Marxists piled out of the Communist Party because that was no longer fashionable and no longer acceptable indeed, and they piled into the environmental movement. My friend Eric Ellington, one of the founders of Greenpeace, told this to me. He said, we didn't found Greenpeace as a left-wing political organization. We founded it because we cared about the environment. We were genuinely upset at the degradation of the planet that was going on, and we thought that we should raise its profile. Now that all of us would sympathize with. But he said within a year, most of us founding members left. Patrick Moore, who has also gone public and said what Eric said to me privately, they left because the Marxists had moved in. And Eric said, he said, I'm not political. And indeed, he was about as political as a rabbit. He was a very nice guy. He just wasn't a political guy. And he said, when the Marxists moved in, they were political, intensely so. And we simply didn't know how to keep them out. So they took over Greenpeace because he could see right from then that the left had decided to use environmental extremism as a way of pursuing frankly Marxist agendas, but while looking as though they were really doing it to save the planet, because in that way they could fool school pupils, school teachers, academia, and many businesses, and of course half-baked politicians, into taking the wrong decisions, deeply damaging to Western countries, and all, in fact, in the name of Marxism and not in the name of saving the planet. And after all, as you and I would all believe, the planet was triumphantly saved 2,000 years ago, and it doesn't need to be saved again. But when we look at the environmental arguments that are put forward for this global warming scam, which you'll notice how very keen the left are on this, and even Romney, who has wobbled in that direction before, is beginning to realize the amount of money that your administration has spent on this is just plain silly and has made no real difference to the climate either way. The arguments they use are all fallacies. They are fallacies of logic, and it was that that first brought me into this. I began to notice that all the key arguments that were being used by climate scientists and by newspapers and by politicians on this issue were instances of the dozen commonest fallacies in human discourse, which were first codified by Aristotle in the refutations of the sophists, the bullshitters of his day, 2,350 years ago. And I thought we'd go through some of these fallacies very, very briefly. The commonest argument of all, here advanced by these wretches in the environmental movement, is, and you have to do these in baby talk, because intellectually speaking, that is what they are. They say, there's a consensus. There's a consensus. And what do they mean by this? They mean that all the scientists, they all agree, there's a consensus. Now, the argument from consensus, which the medieval schoolmen were later to label the argumentum ad populum, is the head count fallacy. Just because we are told that a whole lot of people are said to believe a certain thing, it doesn't mean that there is a lot of people who believe that thing, still less that they say they believe it, still less that they do believe it, still less that if they do believe it, they're right to believe it. In other words, the mere fact of a consensus tells you absolutely nothing about the truth or falsity of the proposition to which the consensus is said to subscribe. It is an elementary fallacy. And I kept on hearing this, and I thought, if they haven't got an argument better than that, then maybe there isn't a global warming problem. But then they said, but the consensus is a consensus of experts. X, an unknown quantity. Spurt, a drip under pressure. Because the consensus of experts is another logical fallacy, this time the argumentum ad verecundiam, the argument from appeal to reputation or to authority. That, too, is a shop-worn logical fallacy, even if all the experts line up and say they believe a certain thing is true. They may not indeed be experts, or even if they have a reputation in the field, they may not deserve it. Even if they deserve it, they may not be acting in accordance with it, because they may be making a lot of money pretending there's a problem where there isn't. James Hansen got $1 million plus last year in grants for his so-called climate research. But he spends so much time protesting about coal trains, which he calls death trains, and standing outside the Capitol on a snowy day telling them global warming is happening, that nobody now really believes, and he certainly isn't earning the $1 million plus that he is being given by various left-wing foundations, in effect to act as a propagandist. So the mere fact that there is a consensus of these so-called experts tells us nothing about whether there's really a problem. But then they say, but what about the cuddly polar bears? Polar bears are not cuddly. And even if they were, they're not at threat. There are 5 times as many of them as there were in the 1940s. The real threat to polar bears was from hunting. That is now largely controlled. Not everywhere, but largely controlled. As a result, polar bear populations are increasing. Hardly, as you may think, the profile of a species at imminent threat of extinction. So there you have yet another fallacy, the inappropriate argument from pity. That's not to say that pity has no place in human affairs. Of course it does. But to argue inappropriately from pity is, frankly, a canting fallacy, logically speaking, and they ought not to argue it. Then they say, oh, but Hurricane Katrina was caused by global warming. So they're arguing from the general to the particular in an inappropriate way. That, too, is a logical fallacy. They likewise say that the Arctic ice is melting, and therefore it's our fault. That happens to be two different logical fallacies. Then they say Monckton isn't a member of the House of Lords because the House of Lords says he isn't, but he says he is, so he doesn't know anything about the climate. Well, the House of Lords are wrong. I'm a member of the House of Lords, albeit without the right to sit or vote. And the fact that some left-wing clerk, in conspiracy with the hardliners of the environmental movement, chose to issue a public statement saying he didn't want me to go around saying I'm a member of the House of Lords is neither here nor there. So, Mr. Clark, if you happen to come across this video, know how many millions of people around the world now hold you in exactly the same utter contempt that I do. Come on, show your contempt for this wretch. In fact, he timed this with deliberate malice to make this statement just on the morning that I was going to do a very important debate live for an hour on national Australian television last year. And so the journalists had high old time saying, well, we don't even know whether we should call you Lord Monckton. So the lefty chairman of the meeting, who was rather enjoying this, I said, right, sir, you read out what it says on my passport about who I am. And with enormous reluctance and through gritted teeth, he read out, the holder is the Right Honourable Christopher Monckton, 3rd Viscount of Brenchley. So that was that. But this is what they do, and that is the argumentum ad hominem. And that is a subspecies of one of these common fallacies. And it's the most fundamental fallacy of the lot, the fallacy of ignoratio elenchi, ignorance of the basic method of conducting an honest inquiry in argument. And this fallacy arises when somebody introduces a red herring. Even if I'm not a member of the House of Lords, which I am, that has nothing whatever to do with what I have to say about the climate. That's a separate subject. So to introduce it in a hope that of discrediting me, and that's what the left, that's the only argument they've got left on this global warming thing, that too is a logical fallacy. And in fact, when I got back to the UK, I went to see an eminent barrister specialising in peerage law. I'd never met him before. I said, look, this is what the clerk says, this is what I say, who's right? And after several months of research, going back 1,000 years in peerage history, he said, hey, you're right, the clerk's wrong, you are a member of the House of Lords, albeit without the right to sit and vote, though he said, I think you probably still have that right. But he said they won't let you exercise it. But he said you're fully entitled to say so. So that's what they do. They try to destroy the reputation of anyone who attacks any of their cherished Marxist beliefs, such as the global warming belief. And of course, they do exactly the same with those who raise any question at all about Mr. Obama's birth certificate. They do that by saying, well, they're birthers and they're pointy heads. And in that way, they frighten off the Republicans. I went to see a senior Republican lawyer about this, and I said, look, can you please tell me why it is that nobody in the Republican Party will do anything to save America from this man by getting the original birth certificate looked at properly by forensic investigators? That is surely not a pointy-headed or silly thing to ask for. He said, Monckton, don't touch it. Don't raise it. If you do, they will destroy your reputation. That's why nobody in the Republican Party is saying anything about it. Mitt Romney is terrified of it. He said, don't raise it. They all know it's wrong. We all know it's bogus. But we're not going to do anything because we're frightened of the left. Ladies and gentlemen, are we frightened of the left? No. Oh, come on. Are we frightened of the left? No. Thank you. Well, now, I hope you will convey your lack of fright of the left to those rabbits who now run the various Republican or Libertarian campaigns for the presidency. For it's only in their hands now that anything at all can be done about this. So I wanted to show you this technique that the left are increasingly using in their arrogance. They know now that they cannot win the arguments against capitalism and free markets, which at last Mr. Romney began, rather hesitatingly, to advance in his debate last night. They know they can't beat those arguments. That's why Obama had such a hangdog look as he stared at the floor and grinned fatuously while he heard these elementary economic truths at last spoken by Mr. Romney. They know they can't defeat us on that. They know they can't win the global warming argument. They know they got that wrong because after 15 years without any global warming, it's kind of getting to be a rather hard sell to suggest that warming is going to happen at a rate that is somehow so dangerous that we have to spend trillions on it today. There will be warming if you add CO2 to the atmosphere, but not very much. They understand that now. But they don't care. They know perfectly well that Obama's birth certificate is a forgery. But they don't care. And if anybody dares to take them out on any of these points and challenge it, they will simply go after the reputation of that person. And too many in the Republican Party now are so frightened of having their reputations damaged that they will not stand up as it is their duty to do and fight for their country. And it's not appropriate that we should send our gallant troops into harm's way, as you and our country have done, standing shoulder to shoulder in far-flung frontiers of freedom to defend the liberty that your founding fathers intended you to have, when corruption in the Democratic Party, right at the heart of government, is responded to by craven inaction on the part of the Republican Party. If you go on that way, your freedom cannot and will not survive. I love your country. I do not want to see her fail. I do not want to see the Harley-Davidson factories closed. I do not want to see the nation broken up. I do not want to see the collapse of democracy. It was once said of Britain by the philosopher George Santayana that the world never had sweeter masters. And yet surely, looking at the recent history of our planet, that kindly phrase should still better be spoken of the United States, which has never gone out with her armed forces for the sake of acquiring territory or resources or wealth for herself. She had no ambition to build an international empire. The only time that her forces have gone out to fight, they have gone out to fight so that others may share the freedom that your founding fathers, in their wisdom and their courage, handed down to you. A republic, if you can keep it. I pray, ladies and gentlemen, that you may.
Hip hip hooray for Lord Christopher Monckton.
Very kind.
How's it that we say when we are carry on, Sergeant?
Carry on, Sergeant.
Carry on, Sergeant. If anyone is interested, Lord Monckton will be around for photographs for a little while.
And I'll also take questions now.
And take questions. We're going to adjourn over here. The patrons of the restaurant are desiring to come out that door and smoke.
Okay.
So we'll have a private session of questions. Yes, Camille.
Travel expenses.
Yes, pass the hat around. Who is the hat? Okay. To help defray,
$200 each should cover it.
$200 each should cover it. If you're interested in the Refounding Father Society, please go to the website, refoundingfathersociety.com. Also, we have lots of little R Republican. That's what we call ourselves. We're not capital R, little R Republicans. Coffee mugs, T-shirts, all that sort of stuff. All the way down at the end of the bar. come on down here. We'll have a little Q&A, and thanks for coming out tonight.